Hawaii didn't join the U.S. voluntarily the day America overthrew Hawaii on January 17, 1893. Honolulu looked calm from a distance, like any postcard morning. Palm shadows lay across clean streets, and the harbor water held a metallic shine. Most people think Hawaii fell because America had bigger guns and bigger ships. But Hawaii didn't lose a war. Hawaii lost a balance sheet, and the ledger was already bleeding. We are taught a clean story, like a tourist brochure with the flag stitched on top. We are told Hawaii joined the United States, like a handshake. We are told it was destiny, paperwork, progress. But destiny doesn't sign documents. Creditors do. This is not a story about a heroic battle. It is a story about insolvency, leverage, and the slow, quiet violence of contracts. It is a story where the most dangerous weapon is a receipt, and the final shot is a signature. Think about that word, annexation, and hear what it really means. It means possession without purchase. It means control without consent. It means a nation being treated like a distressed property. A kingdom turned into a liquidation sale. Hawaii, before the coup, was not empty land waiting for a flag. It was a sovereign machine with its own laws, its own diplomacy, its own money. It was a living economy with a heartbeat. And someone decided they could own it. At its height, the Hawaiian Kingdom carried itself like polished gold. There were ceremonies, uniforms, music, and courtly protocol. There were flags that meant something. There were royal rooms lit by electricity, while other capitals still leaned on gaslight. The palace was not only a symbol, it was a statement to the world that Hawaii belonged to Hawaiians. It said, "We are not a plantation." It said, "We are not inventory." It said, "We are a nation." The streets of Honolulu could smell like salt and flowers, but also like sugar. That sweetness wasn't innocent. Sugar is never just sugar in history. Sugar is land. Sugar is labor. Sugar is debt dressed in a white crystal coat. Because under the parades and polite diplomacy, the foundation was rotting. Not from laziness or incompetence, but from an economic trap. Hawaii's economy was being forced to revolve around one crop, one export, one addiction. That addiction was sugar, and sugar needed two things to survive. It needed land you could control, and it needed a market you could access cheaply. Everything else was decoration. Everything else could be bargained away. Now enter the men who didn't wear crowns. They wore suits, carried ledgers, and spoke in the language of efficiency. Some arrived as missionaries or children of missionaries. The first generation talked about salvation. The second generation discovered valuation. They learned the islands better than outsiders ever could. They learned which soil paid the best. They learned which ports moved product faster. They learned that a kingdom is harder to buy than a field, so they began buying the fields first. Land changed hands in slow motion, transaction by transaction, like blood being drained. A deed here, a mortgage there, a quiet sale after a bad season. Ownership moved toward a small circle of families, and with ownership came power. But power was still capped by the monarchy. The king could still appoint officials. Hawaiian law still mattered. The plantation men had money, but they didn't have full control. And in their world, control is the only dividend worth having. Then the American Civil War cracked the market open like a safe. The United States needed sugar, and supply lines shifted. Prices rose. Demand hardened. And Hawaiian plantations turned into money machines that printed profit in cane and sweat. Picture those fields expanding like a stain. Rail lines appeared to feed mills. Mills grew larger, louder, more hungry. And the men at the top became something new, something modern. They became sugar barons, and barons don't like kings. Sugar, though, is a cruel business. It eats bodies. It demands labor in bulk. But disease and displacement had devastated the native population, shrinking the workforce. So the plantation system imported labor from abroad, building a layered society like a cage. At the top sat owners with contracts and lawyers. Below them sat managers with whips disguised as policies. Below them sat workers who were paid too little and charged too much. And the entire structure existed to keep the king moving. This is where the real antagonist appears, not a soldier, not a politician. The antagonist is a market force as cold as steel. It is the American tariff system. It is the U.S. Treasury deciding what sugar is worth. When tariffs favored Hawaiian sugar, the plantations tasted heaven. When tariffs changed, the plantations faced bankruptcy. Their survival depended on a decision made thousands of miles away by men who would never touch a cane knife. So the island economy became addicted to Washington's pricing. One law could turn millionaires into beggars. And when your fortunes depend on another country's tax policy, sovereignty becomes a luxury item. That is how a trap closes. By the late 1880s, the plantation class was rich, organized, and impatient. King Kalakaua stood in their way, and they treated him like a defective part. They didn't want to kill him. They wanted to neuter him. In 1887, they forced a new constitution through intimidation, the kind of document that smells like gun oil, even if it's written in ink. It stripped the monarch's authority and rewired voting rules to favor wealthy foreigners. This was not reform. It was hostile takeover paperwork. It was a balance sheet maneuver applied to a nation. The king's signature wasn't consent. It was a payment made under threat. And the kingdom's political bloodstream started to clot. Now watch what happens when the market turns. In 1890, the McKinley Tariff shifted the sugar game and crushed Hawaii's special advantage. The plantation men saw profits drop, and their fear turned into strategy. When the ledger goes red, morality becomes negotiable. When debt rises, democracy shrinks. The sugar barons did not want to merely recover profits. They wanted to eliminate the risk forever. They wanted Hawaii inside the United States. Annexation was not romance. It was insurance. It was a hedge against tariffs. It was a way to turn foreign sugar into domestic sugar, and domestic sugar meant protection, subsidy, and political cover. Then the throne changed hands in 1891. Queen Liliuokalani stepped into a kingdom already cornered. She was not naive, and she was not weak. She looked at the forced constitution and saw a document shaped like a knife. The people pushed for change. They wanted voting rights restored. They wanted their government back from the plantation boardroom. And the Queen prepared a new constitution that would shift power back toward native Hawaiians. To the plantation elite, this was an existential threat. Not because they would become poor, because they would lose control. And control is the difference between being a businessman and being an owner of a country. So they created a committee with a name designed to sound righteous. They organized in private rooms where fear smells like cigar smoke. They spoke in terms of safety and stability. But their real vocabulary was profit and permanence. Here is the problem, though. They did not have the numbers. They did not have the people. The Queen still held legitimacy, and legitimacy is the one currency they couldn't counterfeit easily. They needed force. They needed leverage. And leverage arrived in the harbor, painted gray. An American warship sitting in Honolulu was not a random detail. It was a silent argument. Steel in the water as a kind of negotiation. The U.S. Minister in Hawaii, John L. Stevens, became the hinge. He could turn a private plot into an international crisis. All he needed was a justification, even a fake one. And fake justifications are cheap. They claimed American lives and property were in danger. They claimed chaos. They claimed urgency. In finance, this is called a forced sale. You announce an emergency to justify taking control before anyone can stop you. On January 16, 1893, U.S. Marines landed. They marched with rifles and discipline, dragging the shape of empire behind them. They did not position themselves like guests. They positioned themselves like a foreclosure notice nailed to a door. Across from the palace, those troops became a visible balance sheet. The Queen could count their rifles like numbers. She could see the Gatling guns like interest accumulating. If she fought, the cost would be paid in blood. Now comes the cruelest part. The Queen chose not to fight because she believed the American system would correct itself. She believed law would beat force. She thought the truth would matter in Washington. That belief was noble. It was also financially illiterate in an age of expansion, because the market does not reward nobility. The market rewards possession. And once a takeover begins, fairness is the first asset sold. The provisional government declared itself in January 1893. Monarchy was pushed aside without the theater of a battlefield. A new regime appeared with familiar names tied to plantations and commerce. A kingdom was treated like a company under new management. The Queen protested, writing words that sounded like a legal brief and a funeral letter at once. She stated she yielded to superior force, not to local rebels. She held on to the idea that the United States, once informed, would undo it. But understand what was happening in the background. While the public watched flags and speeches, the real work happened in documents, telegrams, and economic planning. The coup was a transaction, and Hawaii was the asset. The annexation push did not depend on Hawaiian consent. It depended on American appetite. It depended on strategic calculations. It depended on whether Hawaii's location could be priced as military value. Native Hawaiians resisted in the way a dispossessed people often must. They organized petitions, signatures, and moral pressure. They tried to force the United States to look at itself in a mirror. For a moment, it worked. The annexation treaty slowed, because treaties need bigger votes. The plantation elite could feel the deal slipping. And when a deal starts slipping, you look for a crisis to reset the room. Then 1898 detonated the global mood. War with Spain turned the Pacific into a chessboard. Suddenly Hawaii was not just sugar. Hawaii was coal and refueling. Hawaii was naval reach. Hawaii was Pearl Harbor's promise. The moral question became a rounding error. The petitions became background noise. The Queen became an inconvenient footnote. In wartime, governments spend legitimacy like cash. They borrow against the future and call it necessity. The U.C. could not secure annexation through a treaty easily, so it used a joint resolution. Simple majority, faster process, less scrutiny. If treaties are luxury purchases, a resolution is grabbing the asset off the shelf and walking out. On July 7, 1898, annexation became official policy, and on August 12, 1898, the transfer ceremony lowered one flag and raised another. For some, it was a celebration. For many Hawaiians, it was a burial. Boycotts spoke louder than applause. People stayed away. They wore black, they closed curtains. They refused to lend their presence to the performance. Silence became their protest, a quiet refusal to sign the new reality. Now zoom out and see the machinery. The plantation elite got what they needed: tariff protection and market stability. They reduced their business risk by absorbing Hawaii into a larger political body. They turned uncertainty into guaranteed access. This is the core philosophy, and you can feel its cold logic. History is not decided by speeches. It is decided by who controls the cash flow. When Hawaii's economy was made dependent on sugar and tariffs, the end was engineered. The rule of 3 hits like a hammer. The profits were threatened. The political control was at risk. The American military presence was available. That is momentum, and momentum is harder to stop than a bullet. Now look at this smoking gun moment as a document, not a battle. The forced Constitution of 1887 functioned like a lien against the monarchy. The 1898 resolution functioned like a closing document at a sale. In a normal sale, the owner agrees and gets paid. In a foreclosure, the owner loses control because the system declares the debt more important than the person. Hawaii's annexation was sold like a foreclosure, dressed as law. If you could hear those closed-door discussions, the language would be brutal. Not poetic, not patriotic. It would sound like, "We can't lose this margin." It would sound like, "We need domestic status." It would sound like, "Make it permanent." And this is where the climax lands, the default. The monarchy's authority evaporated because the kingdom's power could not compete with the economic machine pressing in. Sovereignty is solvency. When the money and markets turned, sovereignty cracked. What does default look like for a nation? It looks like humiliation without a gunshot. It looks like your laws being overwritten by strangers. It looks like your flag lowered while you are still alive to watch it. It looks like land values shifting into outside hands. It looks like culture being packaged into entertainment. It looks like the economy being redesigned to serve a new center, and you are told to smile for tourists. The social consequences are not always immediate famine. Sometimes they are slower, like chronic pain. Dispossession spreads across decades. Wealth concentrates. Political voice thins. The people become workers on land their grandparents named. The islands did not stop being beautiful. That is the trap. Beauty makes the theft easier to hide. Resorts can be built over memory. High-rise hotels can cover the place where a nation's independence was quietly taken. Now the generational aftermath stretches long. The plantation economy hardened into corporate dominance, with a few firms controlling shipping, land, and finance. Those structures didn't vanish quickly. They shaped the territory's life for decades. The queen lived on, but without her crown's power. She became a living symbol of a broken contract. She insisted on what she was, not because she was stubborn, but because identity is the last property you can defend. Decades later, the United States would issue apologies and acknowledgments. Words arrived, but words are not restitution. Paper apologies don't transfer land back. They don't reverse time. They don't erase the ledger marks carved into lives. Let that sink in. A nation can be taken, and later someone can say sorry, while the ownership remains unchanged. That is the final insult to financial conquest. The profit stays even when the guilt arrives. So what is the lesson if you strip away romance and myth? Hawaii's overthrow was not only a political coup, it was a supply chain decision. It was tariff math. It was a corporate strategy to lock in margins. It was the moment when accountants outranked kings, when a plantation's risk profile mattered more than a people's sovereignty, when the balance sheet became the Constitution, and when insolvency became the excuse for invasion. If you're still thinking, but wasn't this about patriotism, ask yourself a simpler question. Who got richer after the flag changed? Who gained land, tariffs, protection, and permanence? Follow that money trail like a detective follows footprints, because in the end, history is written twice. First by the winners in contracts, then by the survivors in memory. And memory is stubborn, even when it's buried under concrete and cocktails with umbrellas. If you want more stories like this, the ones hidden behind the glossy postcards, subscribe to the channel. Stay ahead of the people who only read the tourist version, because the real story is always in the ledger, and the ledger never forgets.